Hey everyone, thanks for joining. My name is César. I'm a designer usually based in Brooklyn, New York. And today I'm going to be talking about the opportunities and challenges presented by Latinofuturism when it comes to design. To start, I'll be discussing what a speculative design practice entails and how it is different from traditional practice. I'll discuss some parallels between Afrofuturism and Latinofuturism, which some of you might be familiar with already. And while both of these have similar goals, they aspire to to decolonize, they also have some key differences that I'll be going over. And to better understand these, I will be giving a brief overview of the history of European coloniality in the state of Chiapas, Mexico, where the Zapatista movement got started in the 90s. This should set up the ideological framework behind Mexico 44, a case study in speculative design based in the not-so-far future, where indigenous communities of southern Mexico are hyper-commodified and exported to the rest of the world in the search for an urban authenticity. And as with the rest of the talks, we'll also have some time at the end for Q&A, hopefully. Cool. So, what is speculative critical design? Design as we know it has always been predicated in the conception of an optimistic future by means of fixing the present. We also know this as problem solving. However, the lines between designing and dreaming become blurry as we confront larger global challenges. It's become clear that issues such as climate change require a dramatic shift in our values, attitudes, and behaviors, rather than traditionally designed object or system. Moreover, traditional design practice as it's seen in our everyday exists within a neoliberal context. This means that the survival of the profession is predicated on the monetization of its offerings. The solutions we provide must meet our expected profit margins and happen within a clear timeline. This nearsighted approach makes it nearly impossible for the industry to fully tackle the root cause of these larger issues we're seeing, which is mainly capitalism itself. So, perhaps what we can start doing instead is designing for things that could be, also known as speculating. Speculative design aims to open up new perspectives and create spaces for discussion and debate regarding alternative ways of being. The social dreaming can act as a catalyst for the collective redefining of our relationship to reality, and thus begin to outline the steps that may lead us to what we currently see as unreachable dreams. Speculative design becomes critical when it challenges our narrow set of assumptions about the role of products and services in everyday life. Critical design is meant to highlight weaknesses within our system in order to give way to better alternatives. It goes beyond plain criticism and is more so interested in highlighting systematic shortcomings through design rather than words. I personally became interested in exploring the role of this particular form of design as it could apply to decolonization. What objects and services could we design as we aim to delink ourselves from Anglo-European ways of knowing, producing, and seeing? So, what is Afrofuturism, and what could Latinofuturism look like? A prime example of speculative fiction that has been making itself into cultural zeitgeist is that which has been labeled Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism encompasses the works of literature, film, and music that address the relationship of Black people to technology, and by extension, the forces that design them. These works use themes of science fiction such as abduction, slavery, displacement, and alienation to re-narrate the past, the present, and the future of the African diaspora. Popular works include the acclaimed novels of Octavia Butler, Janelle Monáe's 2018 visual album Dirty Computer, and even Marvel Comics' The Black Panther. The narratives of these, as well as other pieces of Afrofuturism, tend to have a central theme: technologies that have been historically brought to bear Black bodies. Technologies such as branding, forced sterilization, prisons, and surveillance, to name a few. The reinforcement of white supremacy and furthering of social inequality brought upon by these technologies has not been incidental. They have been designed to do so. Afrofuturism recontextualizes these systems of oppression within the worlds of fiction, that way inviting us to take a critical look at the way that they might exist and manifest themselves within our day-to-day. Latinofuturism in many ways has the same goals as Afrofuturism. It seeks to call attention to and eventually dismantle our inheritance from European colonial power. However, unlike the African diaspora, the group of people who identify as Latinx are often the embodiment of bodies that are both the oppressor and the oppressed. To fully reject our European inheritance would be to reject, for most of us, the entirety of our existence in favor of something completely different. So the question is, how can fiction, and specifically design fiction, address issues shared by the entire population that have such different shared histories? To further clarify this point, I will be going over a brief history of how European coloniality has made its way into the cultural fabric of Mexico, even way after independence. So, we start with the arrival of the Spanish settlers into current-day Mexico in 1522. This, for the most part, marks the end of the larger indigenous civilizations from that time, most notably the Aztec and the Maya empires. In Chiapas, due to the difficulty to navigate geography as well as to the lack of gold and silver, colonizers decided to make the region a secondary priority. The few conquistadores that did establish themselves in the region made land and labor the top resource. The distance and relative isolation from Mexico City made the region a free-for-all in regards to the Indian laws and regulations, which started a cycle of abuse which we can still see today. While the country became independent in 1821, the initial distance of Chiapas to the Spanish crown meant little to no change in the state of affairs. Moreover, land previously owned by the crown was sold off to private investors, which intensified the economic disparity among social groups. In 1876, we see Porfirio Diaz taking power for what would become a 36-year regime. His main goal during this time would be to modernize the Mexican economy and infrastructure by modeling other European countries. Mexico did develop economically for some. However, most others fell behind. Elites gained wealth and influence while the majority of the population had to accept the new order of things. This growing disparity is what eventually led to the Mexican Revolution. The failure of this 35-year-long regime resulted in a nationwide revolt in 1910. Over time, the revolution changed from a revolt into more of a multi-sided civil war in particular regions. But yet again, due to the isolation from the rest of the country, justice that was brought upon by the revolution never really reached the region of Chiapas. Fast forwarding to the 90s, we see the North America Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA, being signed by Canada, Mexico, and the United States in 1992, which created a trade bloc between these countries. The agreement that came into force in January 1st, 1994, removed tariffs on most goods produced and sold in North America. The passage of NAFTA allowed for corporations to start purchasing land and belongings to indigenous populations and use it to produce cheap crops. This put further strain on local farmers and merchants who had to compete with these new cash crops. With the passing of NAFTA, the indigenous towns of Chiapas rose up to demand the end to this unregulated cycle of abuse that they had been subjected to since the start of the Spanish crown. Under the name of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, the armed organizations declared war on the Mexican state. Their list of demands included work, land, housing, health, education, independence, liberty, democracy, justice, and peace. The Zapatista movement avoided identifying with any specific doctrine or ideology, as from the beginning, the revolution was meant to be an open and flexible platform for indigenous voices, rather than a top-down revolt. Nonetheless, the movement pointed to a singular argument, the reaffirming of their existence in the midst of a neoliberal capitalist globalization. As a result of the uprising's momentum and the lack of cooperation from the Mexican government, the Zapatistas founded 5 caracoles across the state. The organized indigenous-led communities were created in 2003 as autonomous entities. They rejected the government aid and lived largely off profits from transnational NGOs. In the end, the Zapatista movement starts painting a picture for an alternative model, in which a globalized world can allow for existence of multiple identities, conceptions, and ideologies. The Zapatista movement sets up a robust framework for a Latinofuturist practice. In order to retaliate against systematic oppression within the Latin American context, speculative fiction should address the faults of Western universality. That means that the idea that the European modernity is the only way forward. To aspire towards Western modernity is to reproduce the systems of power and oppression that conceived it in the first place. In addition, this one-track-minded mentality at a global scale places our society further away from solving the issues brought upon by neoliberalism. Latino society should aspire to develop multiple worldviews within its scope of development. We should aspire to dismantle the myth of universality. So moving on, I'm going to present the case study. So as an intro, Mexico 44 is a piece of speculative design I worked on during my time in architecture school. And as a forewarning, this piece is meant to be tongue-in-cheek, bordering on satire. Cool. So here's the setup. On the wake of the 50th anniversary of NAFTA, Mexico is finally able to achieve the first world status it's been working towards for so long. The isolated pockets of culture in the Chiapas highlands facing imminent extinction are graciously saved by the Federal Cultural Preservation Bureau. Their vivid traditions and crafts are safe for the masses to consume through the charm of the free market. The culture they fabricate, our culture, serves as a reminder of the civilizations that had to rise and decay to give way to our great modernity. In light of this, Mexico undergoes a national rebranding campaign. Mexico 44, the world's largest exporter of culture. Through an extensive international marketing campaign, Mexico 44 promises the flourishing of unique urban characters in deteriorating, globalized neighborhoods. By exporting a piece of indigenous land, the transplants are able to revitalize the culture of these homogenized cities under a comprehensive 20-year plan. This urban renewal program is broken up into 5 distinct steps over the span of 20 years. Step number 1 is selection. Sites are selected within the financial capitals of the global north, where the fetishization and commodification of outside identity allows for culture to become a purchasable commodity. Number 2, installation. The transplant is installed into the host. The program recommends allocating at least 7 to 15 urban blocks to start. The transplant is then walled up in order to isolate it from the rest of the urban context. Walls should be kept up and heavily guarded for at least 3 years. During this time, the transplant culture is expected to undergo certain changes to its cultural practices as they are adapted to their new geography. These changes are to be carefully monitored and documented. Developers and stakeholders will begin to show interest in the real estate surrounding the walled-up territory, which will lead to an initial economic burst. Step number 3 is exposure. At this point, initial markets of commercial transaction between the host and the transplant territories are established. All goods and services are carefully screened to ensure that they don't disrupt the worldview of the transplant. This is when novel settings start to adapt and securitize to the new host territory. Vertical real estate development in the neighborhoods start to increase, as vantage points looking into the transplant territory become a luxury amenity. Number 4 is integration. Continued trade and crossbreeding between both territories over the years produce a visible and impactful transformation to the character of the world geography. A true and authentic culture flourishes, and a rise in tourism is expected to emerge as the rest of the world travels to the territory to experience firsthand the wonders of the authentic cultural production. And finally, step 5. After 20 years, the host territory itself should be ready to be exported as a transplant to other localities, and this should start the cycle all over again. This work is meant to point out the many weaknesses within our current reality in order to build discourse. Is this what it takes for the indigenous communities of the global south to thrive in a neoliberal, globalized market? Latinofuturism is meant to paint a picture of what the future could be, whether utopian or dystopian. However, when inspected closely, Latinofuturism is most impactful when it recontextualizes the past, as the idea that change can only happen in the future is in itself a Western construct. There is no single method towards decolonization. It is slow, it must start with oneself, and unlike the design industry, it isn't solution-driven. My hope is that design practice can start to evolve away from its current paradigm towards one that can start to tap into our collective imagination and allow us to dream of solutions that carry us forward. Thank you. I'd like to thank some of the works that I referenced within this presentation and throughout my thesis and the work. First off, Ahmed Ansari's Modernity and Coloniality lecture series that has been going on this summer. Also, people such as Ruha Benjamin, Walter Magnolio, Anthony Dunn, and Fiona Raby. Also acknowledge the people around the world who allowed the Zapatista movement to happen and continue evolving. And finally, my friend Ivy, who proofread my presentation, allowed me to practice on her. Thank you very much.